You ever had this happen to you? You're trying to make some sort of decision. Maybe it's something inconsequential. Maybe it's something big. But in the process of trying to navigate that decision, there's a phrase that pops into your mind unexpectedly that sheds light on your decision and helps you really get to the heart of the issue. So I'm thinking of phrases like, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. All that glitters is not gold. Strike while the iron is hot. Don't judge a book by its cover. I was thinking earlier this morning, when I was in high school and college, every once in a while I would visit my grandparents, and I would come in and I would be carrying some recent purchase that I was really impressed with. And my grandpa's response would be, a fool and his money are soon parted. And I kind of knew what he was saying. Something else he would sometimes say, it's not what you make, it's not how much you make, it's what you do with what you make. And some of you have heard that. Some of you are thinking of phrases right now that maybe your grandparents or your parents sort of just ingrained in your head when you were younger. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, all's fair in love and war, picture's worth 1,000 words, beggars can't be choosers, blood is thicker than water, discretion is the better part of valor, a stitch in time saves 9. I don't know what that means, but I'm sure it's true, because I've heard it all my life, and you probably have too. But there are certain phrases that just sort of come out of nowhere, and they help you avoid mistakes, hopefully navigate complex decisions. For a lot of people, they are words to live by. If you have your Bible with you, I want you to turn to Micah chapter 6. You might want to use your phone. If you have a hard time finding this, just raise your hand, and David will come help you, because it's kind of tucked away towards the back of the Old Testament. This is a section of the Bible outside of the story of Jonah that most of us are pretty unfamiliar with. Most of us don't spend a lot of time reading this, but just to give you a little bit of background so that what we're going to read makes sense, Micah was a prophet who lived 700 years before the birth of Jesus. So just keep that in the back of your mind. He was from a place called Morsheth, which was located 22 miles southwest of Jerusalem. In the Old Testament, Jerusalem is kind of where all the action is. It's kind of ground zero, but Micah's not there. He's out in the country. 22 miles is a pretty far distance in those days. So he doesn't spend his time roaming the city. He's out there in the fields. That's where he spends most of his time. He had a more famous counterpart that you may be familiar with, the prophet Isaiah. And both of these guys lived at the same time. They lived in the same area. And Micah and Isaiah both lived during a time in history that was called the divided kingdom. So what had happened is, because of their disobedience, the people of God, the Jewish people, had been divided into two separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom where Micah lived was called the kingdom of Judah. If you go back and you read this part of the story, the part of the Old Testament, you'll discover that both of these two kingdoms got caught up in the same vicious cycle. And the way it would work is they would go through a period of relative stability. Everything was peaceful. Everything was going well. And then as that period continued, they would get complacent like all of us do. And then they would fall from obedience into disobedience, and that disobedience would deepen until God finally had enough. And he said, if you don't do something about this, I'm going to come in and destroy you. So he would sort of send them these warning messages. They would heed the warning. They would turn back to him. And then the whole process would start over. It was this cycle of obedience and disobedience followed by punishment, followed by further obedience. It just kept going on like that forever. Now, here's why that's important. At this point in the story where we're going to read today, the people of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, have fallen into this period of deep disobedience. The king at that time was a guy named Ahaz, and he was all in when it came to worshiping false gods. So during this kingdom, one of the things they did is they would go throughout this empire and they would build all of these shrines, literally hundreds of these shrines to these false gods. And then if that wasn't bad enough, he even sacrificed 2 of his own children to the false god Molech. So this is a guy who was pretty far gone in a bad direction. At the same time all of that was going on, at the same time he's doing all that, historians tell us there began to emerge in the kingdom of Judah this very wealthy upper class that made most of their money completely off the backs of those who were less fortunate. They had this scheme where they would go in and the rich people would seize the property of the poor people, and because the poor people didn't have the resources to fight back, everybody just accepted it. And so the rich just continued to get richer. They owned more and more land. They had more and more resources, while the poor people were getting squeezed tighter and tighter. So as a culture, they had become almost completely corrupt. I want you to listen to some of these phrases that historians use to describe them. Corrupt business practices, illegal property seizures, rampant idolatry, a failure of civil leadership, increasing violence, and unchecked selfishness. Now, if you'd been on the outside looking in, they look pretty peaceful. They look pretty prosperous. I mean, they had a growing economy and secure borders. But from the inside looking out, it was a story of increasing darkness and spiritual decay. Now, let me just stop there a second and ask you, does any of that sound familiar? I want you to listen to the way this same writer described the culture that Micah lived in. Here's what he said. They had settled on pursuing the allure of more comfort, more stuff, more riches. Now listen to this line. They lived in a 700 BC version of our world. Let me read that again. They lived in a 700 BC version of our world. Now, sometimes you read the Bible, you think, well, that was written a long time ago, especially the Old Testament. You know, there's not much that really has to do with the world that we live in. And yet you start to look at what was actually going on, and you realize that whether it was 8 centuries before Christ or 21st century, 21 centuries later, it's all the same. People are people. All of us are prone to selfishness. There's something deep within our DNA that, if unchecked, causes us to turn inward and satisfy ourselves at the expense of others. The Bible calls it our sin nature. And you see evidence of it everywhere you look. If you've watched the news in the last few months, or last few years, or even the last few hours, you've seen more than enough evidence to know that something's gone terribly wrong. And in the book of Micah, what you have is God the Father, through his prophet, his spokesman, the prophet Micah, bringing a lawsuit against his people. As you read through it, it reads sort of like an indictment. He's given them one last chance to respond to the charges and avoid a death sentence. One of the problems they had is, even though there was 2 divided kings, if you look at a map, outside and around them, there were these 2 growing empires, the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, who were known for their brutality. And so God, all throughout this book, says to them, hey, if you guys don't change direction, if you don't turn this thing around, I'm going to take my hand of protection off you, and I'm going to allow either the Assyrians or maybe the Babylonians or maybe both to come in and destroy you. If you know your history, you know that's eventually what happened. So the question they're asking is, what should we do? I mean, we know things have gone off the rails. What can we do about it? And that may be the question that you've been asking. And as I said, it's increasingly evident that we live in a culture in which things are going off the rails. I mean, I don't have to prove it to you. You just have to look around. The New York Times, just this week, I kept track, just this past week, had articles talking about suicide rate is continuing to climb exponentially. Violent crime is up dramatically nationwide. Drug overdoses are at an all-time high. Church attendance is at an all-time low. And human trafficking has reached such proportion they don't even know how to put a number on it. And you look at all that and you realize that all of that has become sort of the background noise that we live with. It's part of the fabric of our daily lives. And the truth is that we find ourselves living in a 21st century version of the same world that Micah lived in. So the question is, what do we do about it? If you have your Bible open, Micah chapter 6, I want you to look at the first few verses as we look at how the people of Israel tried to respond to God's charges. Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead my case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, you mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, plotted, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you might know the righteous acts of the Lord. Again, it reads like a court case. He says, here's the charge against you. And he calls court into session. He's going to call the creation itself as a witness against them. And then just to drive home his point, he points out some things that he's done for them in the past. He helped them escape Egyptian slavery. He sent them a leader in the person of Moses. He oversaw them on their journey to the promised land. He protected them from their enemies. And even after all of that, they still continue to turn their back to him. Then you get down to verse 6, and Micah changes perspective, and now instead of speaking to the people on behalf of God, he's speaking to God on behalf of the people. He's sort of like a mediator in this role. He's trying to answer the question, what do you expect us to do? So you look at verse 6, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Now, the ancient Israelites, they lived in a culture in which sacrifice was seen as the entry fee for good standing with God. So it was assumed that the more you sacrifice, the more God would be pleased with you. So you read through this, you see the progression. They want to know, what's it going to take for us to get back on God's good side? How many burnt offerings? How many rams? How much gallons of olive oil is it going to take? And then they go so far in verse 7, they say, what if we offer up our firstborn child? I mean, what if we sacrifice our child? Would that be enough to sort of restore this relationship and get God off our backs and avoid punishment? But then in verse 8, Micah answers the question from the perspective of God with a three-part answer. Here's what he says. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, we hear a lot of talk in our world about the good life, and people have different ways of defining it. For most people, it's financial independence. For other people, it's free time, or maybe it's a combination of those things. So now I've got the time and the money to do whatever I want. Some people would add, I want to have a healthy family with that, some solid friendships. You put all those things together, and that's sort of the picture of the good life that all of us hold in the back of our minds. You may have some other things you would add to the list. But what if we were wrong? What if we really got that wrong? What if we had misdefined what a good life, or what the good life is really all about? What you have in Micah 6:8 is the Old Testament prophet answering the question, what does a good life really look like? And Micah would say that a good life, or the good life, is a life that acts justly, loves mercy, and walks humbly with God. So over the next couple of weeks, Dave and I are going to explore each of these three statements, and we're going to start today by tearing apart that little statement, acting justly. What does it mean to act justly? The Hebrew word for justice has two separate meanings, but both are equally important. And we're going to put this on the screen just so you don't miss it. It's the idea of retribution combined with restoration. Now, we get the retribution part. We see somebody do something wrong, we want to see them be punished. We want to see them receive retribution. And the worse the crime is, the more time we want them to do. Everybody sort of understands that. We cheer when the bad guys get caught. But the second part of that is the one we sometimes ignore. It's this idea of restoration. Justice is not just punishing someone who does wrong. It also includes helping to restore someone who's been wronged. It means helping those who are the victims of injustice. Now, if you're following along on the app or in your bulletin or however you're doing it, there are three things that acting justly requires. And here's the first one. To act justly, you first have to identify injustice. You first have to be able to recognize when something going on around you is unjust. Now, whenever you apply for a job, most of the time you're given here's the list of requirements you have to meet, and if you meet these requirements, then you'll be a candidate for the job. Then you get the job, and here's your job description, and here's what you have to do to maintain your job and keep your job moving forward. And everybody, it's all sort of cut and dry. Now, if you were to ask most people, hey, what's the job description for somebody that wants to be in good standing with God, what would they say? Most people would start with church attendance, right? Hey, you've got to go to church. You've got to give, at some level. If you're super spiritual, maybe you volunteer. Maybe you're in a group of some sort. And that's what it is for most people. That tends to be the way we think. That's the way the people in Micah's day thought too. But what if that wasn't it? I mean, as important as those things are, what if that wasn't the baseline of what God was asking us to do? In Luke 4, Luke tells us about the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, Jesus' public ministry. And at this point, Jesus is about 30 years old, and he's sort of been out in the wilderness for a while. Hasn't really made a name for himself yet. And he goes to a synagogue there in Nazareth, which was his hometown. And as he goes, he stands up and he's given the scroll of Isaiah. And he flips through some pages, which is really cool. As I said earlier, Isaiah was taking place at the same time Micah was written. So the way I envision it, Micah's on one side of town and Isaiah's on the other side of town. And, they're kind of working together to change the region. So Jesus takes this part of the scroll of Isaiah, and I want you to look at the first thing he reads in this synagogue. He reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Now, we're going to keep that on there for just a second because I want to come back to something. But what happens in this scene is Jesus reads this, right? Then he rolls the scroll back up and he hands it to the attendant, and then he stands up and it says every eye is glued on him, and the first line to his sermon is, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And everybody's mind explodes because they never heard anything like that. If you go back and you look at this, I highlighted it for you. Jesus names right from the very beginning 4 groups of people that he came with the express purpose of trying to share the good news with: the poor, prisoners, the blind or the handicapped, and the oppressed. Now here's the scary thing. If we were forced to be honest, we would have to admit that those 4 categories of people represent categories that most of us are pretty good at ignoring. But they're not the only people that we're pretty good at ignoring. For most of us, man, we go through our day-to-day lives and we've got this tunnel vision thing and we've got our deal and we've got blinders on. We don't even notice the people around us. Some of you work with single moms who are struggling to make ends meet, and they never talk about it, but you never notice. Some of us live in neighborhoods where there's an elderly couple who's been targeted by online scammers, and they don't know who to turn to. We try to distance ourselves from the recovering addict who's desperately trying to rebuild his life. We like to pretend as if domestic violence and child abuse and human trafficking doesn't exist in our community, because to admit otherwise would be too much. Rusty George used to preach in Lexington. He preaches out in California now at a large Christian church. A few years ago, he rewrote Isaiah chapter 1. You go back and just read this later, and he just sort of paraphrased it as if it was written to the modern church instead of the ancient church. And I want you to listen to what he wrote. This is from the perspective of if God wrote us a letter. Here's what he wrote. "All of your church services, what are they to me? I have enough praise offerings, clap offerings, and Christmas offerings. I have no pleasure in your reading my book, arguing about what I meant, and calling yourself holy. I cannot bear your conferences and rallies that promote your platforms. Even though you think you're honoring me with your worship, you're neglecting those in need. You step over homeless people on your way to your cathedrals. You sing to me on Sunday, but steal from your boss on Monday. You pray for a parking spot at the mall while children are being trafficked." See, part of acting justly means you got to have your eyes open enough to recognize that there's injustice happening around you. Now, the second thing is that once you identify injustice, you begin to invest in restoration. Now, if you're like me, as soon as you hear that word invest, you probably think of money. And for a lot of us, our first instinct whenever we encounter injustice is we try to ignore it. And then if it becomes too obvious or if it's too big of a problem, then we'll take it to the next level and we'll give some money. We'll give of our resources to try and combat it. So, for example, if I'm worried about abortion, it's easy for me to go to the pregnancy center once a year and make a nominal contribution. If I'm worried about the drug problem, I can donate $20 now and then to the local rehab facility. Or if I'm worried about poverty, I'll collect some canned goods once or twice a year and go over to the Hope Center and drop those off. And it's easy for me to sort of feel good about that, and I can walk away thinking I've done my part. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with doing those things, but remember that the Hebrew word for justice also means restoration. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, there's a great book titled "When Helping Hurts" And in the book, the writers talk about the 3 levels of response to injustice. We're going to put this on the screen so you don't miss it. They're relief, rehabilitation, and development. Now, you understand immediately what relief is. You see a need, and it's an acute need, so you give of your time or resources to help somebody. You provide relief. So somebody's hungry, you buy them a meal. Somebody can't afford their medicine, so you take a few dollars out of your pocket and you pay for your medicine. And for most of us, we're pretty good at that. I mean, that's what we like to do. Makes us feel good. There's a short-term reward for that. But we rarely ever get to the second step, which is rehabilitation, and almost never get to that third step, which is development. Most of us are content with offering relief. But let's be honest, a lot of the time, that's not really helping all that much. A lot of time, all we're doing is creating a short-term solution that creates more long-term problems. But we know that if we take it from there to the next level, it's going to get hard because now it's going to require more than a few dollars. It's going to require some time and some energy and some emotional investment. Over in Isaiah 58, there's an interesting verse where Isaiah says, "If you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday." Now, what's it mean to spend yourself? I know what it means to spend your money, but what does it mean to spend yourself? It means to get personally involved. It means to take valuable time out of your busy schedule and invest that time in helping other people. Christine Cain's a writer. She wrote, "It's one thing to be awakened to injustice and quite another to be willing to be inconvenienced and interrupted to do something about it." Let me paraphrase that. It's one thing to give money to the pregnancy center. It's something else to volunteer your time to help a young girl who feels like she doesn't have any options. It's one thing to decry the impact of generational poverty. It's something different to help a young man navigate life so he gets opportunities to break free from that. It's one thing to talk about how bad the drug problem is in our community. I mean, everybody knows that, but it's something different to host a recovery group. I mean, most of us are pretty good at providing relief when what's most needed and most valuable over the long term is not just relief, but rehabilitation and development so that people can actually move forward. Now, there's one more piece to this puzzle, and to be honest, this may be the hardest one, and this is when you administer self-justice. So I got to be able to identify injustice. I've got to be willing to invest in restoration, but I also have to be willing to administer some self-justice. So let me ask you, have you ever done something that looking back on it was unjust? Have you ever taken advantage of somebody? Have you ever enriched yourself at somebody else's expense? I mean, at the time, you may have convinced yourself, hey, they deserved it. They had it coming. You may have convinced yourself, hey, it was just business. But now that there's been some separation, you look back on it and you don't feel very good about it, and you realize that what you did was not just unkind, but that it was unjust. Have you ever done that? Let me answer the question for you. The answer is yes. If you're a human being like I am, you've done that. All of us have this thing that's deeply ingrained in us that pulls us in that direction. It's called the sin nature. So all of us are guilty. All of us in our own way, at one point or another, have been perpetrators of injustice. And I think part of what it means to act justly is to go back as best you can and undo some of the unjust things that you've personally done. I mean, that's really what this whole book of Micah is about. God is giving the people one last chance to turn things around. If you still have your Bible up, I want you to look at verse 9. It's the very next verse that comes after the famous verse that we read in Micah 6:8. Now, you go to Hobby Lobby, you're going to see all sorts of these little plaques with Micah 6:8 written on them. And you can get online. It's a really popular verse. A lot of people have it, tattooed on their arm or their leg or something. But nobody has verse 9. Here's what it says. "Listen, the Lord is calling to the city, and to fear your name is wisdom." Now listen to this line. "Heed the rod and the one who appointed it." Heed the rod and the one who appointed it. It's like God is saying, hey, this is your final opportunity. I'm giving you one more chance. You can turn this thing around before I bring the rod of justice down on you. And you keep reading the chapter, you know what he does? He names the things that need to change. He talks about ill-gotten gains, dishonest scales, violence, and dishonesty. I mean, these are the things that had come to define their lives. He says, these are the things you need to make right. So I'm giving you one last opportunity for you to administer some self-justice before I bring some divine justice. Now, here's my question. What if that was written to you? I mean, he names what they had going on. What about us? Are there areas of your life where you've been unjust? Maybe there's a check that you need to write to pay an unpaid debt. Maybe there's somebody that you need to go to and you need to mail them a letter or make a visit and offer an apology that's long overdue. Maybe there's a period of restoration and repair that you need to do because you've damaged somebody's business, you've damaged somebody's property, or maybe even their reputation. Maybe there's a business practice that you need to stop because you realize it's not just unkind, it's dishonest. And I don't know what it is for you, but I know that if you think about it long enough, you'll probably find some areas of your life where you need to administer some self-justice so God doesn't have to administer any divine justice. When I told you there are certain phrases that help you make sense of decisions, especially complex decisions. Have a way of simplifying things, giving you a new lens through which to view certain situations. And what happens in the situation of justice, there's so much misinformation, so much disinformation, we don't even know where to start with things. And then you look, and if you pay attention, and you're just inundated with all these problems, and all these problems have all these different layers, and it can get overwhelming. You think, well, I really want to be a part of the solution, right? I really want to make things better, but I'm not sure where to start. And because there are so many issues, what happens is we wind up being paralyzed by that, and we're not sure where to turn. So because we can't do it for everybody, we don't do it for anybody. Because I can't help everyone, I'm not going to help anyone. There's a phrase that you've seen on the screen there that I hope you'll write down because it'll help you think through some of these issues. It goes like this: do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. Let's say it again. Do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. Do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. Now, that may not be as popular or as well known as some of the phrases we started with, but I'm telling you, it can be just as powerful. Everybody's got limited time. Everybody's got limited resources. You know you can't solve every problem because you know that. You think we're off the hook. I can't solve every problem, so I'm not going to solve any problems. I can't help everybody, so I'm not going to help anybody. But the truth is, you can do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. What if there was one person or one issue or one organization that you could pour yourself into and really make a difference over the long term? I know you can't do it for everybody. I can't either. All of us together can't do it for everybody, but we could all do it for one. What if there was one struggling family that you could invest in? What if there was one recovering addict that you could help experience a fresh start? What if there was one questioning teenager, doesn't have anybody in their life to talk to, but you can help them because you're just a little further down the road than there? What if there was one handicapped adult that you could befriend that everybody else ignores? What if there was one ministry or one organization or even one church that you could volunteer for? You could volunteer with them, and you could really make a huge difference. I mean, nobody expects you to do it for everybody because you can't do it for everybody. But you could do it. You could do it for one person or one family or one organization. Micah said it like this: He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Notice he uses that word require. He doesn't say, hey, this is a suggestion. Hey, when you got some free time and things slow down, there's nothing else to do, you can focus on it. He doesn't say this. He says, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. I want you to stand with me. We're going to close in just a second. And as we do, we want to give you an opportunity to respond to this message. We had some folks respond first service, and And maybe you're here this morning. There's two things that could happen with a message like this. Maybe you're here and this is over the last few minutes, it struck you, hey, I did do something that was unjust. I did do something that was unfair. I have been a perpetrator of injustice. And it could be that right now you need to make a decision that moving forward, you're going to do the best you can to undo that. Maybe you can't undo all of it, but maybe you can at least offer an apology. And sometimes you can't move forward till you take care of what's in the past. So I want to encourage you, if there's something that God laid on your heart as we've been sharing together, take care of it. It's not worth spending the rest of your life looking in the rearview mirror wishing, boy, I'd done something about that. For the rest of you, though, it could be that you're here and what you need to do is spend these next few moments praying. And I want you to pray and ask God to show you that one person, that one opportunity, that one family, that one organization, that one church that you can pour your life into. And you can't do it for everybody. I know you can't do it for everybody. Nobody can. But you could do it for one. And I want you to ask God to show you that one. Now, if you need to pray with somebody, you want to put your membership here, whatever it is you want to do, we'll do something publicly. Dave and I are here. You just come and we'd be glad to pray with you. We won't embarrass you. You don't have to say anything, and we're not going to do anything weird. Just if you want to pray with somebody, we're here. But more than anything, I guess most of us probably need to pray that the Lord would show us just one.